Happy birthday, everyone. I'm glad we could all be here for this momentous occasion. What do you mean you don't know whose birthday it is? Shame on you for forgetting. It's the ATX standard. That's right, as of this year, ATX is 30 years old. So its memories of how exciting it was to buy a beer or rent a car without paying an underage driver fee are rapidly fading to be replaced by the aches and pains of a slowly failing body. Or they would be if ATX showed any signs of slowing down. Despite a couple attempts over the years to displace it with something newer and shinier, ATX just keeps on trucking, and as a result, the last 3 decades of PC hardware are virtually all intercompatible. You can put a Socket 5 Pentium board from 1995 into a fractal design case. Yes, the one with the wood trim on the front. Plug it into your 1200 watt Thermaltake power supply, install an S3 Trio 32 PCI graphics card, hook up the front panel connectors and hit the button, and the damn thing is guaranteed to fire up and work. Even the I/O cutout on the back will fit perfectly, assuming you still have the shield, which isn't very likely at this point, but the fact remains. And the reverse is true as well. You could take a brand new board, stick it in an ancient case, and everything will just work, except probably for your massive 3-slot graphics card. There's limitations, but in a world so cluttered with redundant, incomplete, or non-existent standards, ATX is an astonishing achievement. So, naturally, it has its exceptions. Like those boards with connectors on the back that showed up a couple years ago, those won't mount in a case from 1995, or one from 2005 or 2015, or most from 2025. They basically require a special chassis with special cutouts, and arguably that means they aren't ATX. Like, to be clear, the standard isn't incredibly thorough, and as far as I can tell, they haven't even updated the primary specs since 2004. There have been several major changes to the power standard, but the bulk of the document doesn't seem to have been touched in over 20 years. And that's because there just isn't that much to it. Besides the power supply, ATX mostly just defines the physical layout of a motherboard and how it mounts in a case. That means the screw holes, the location of the card slots, where the CPU goes so it doesn't block any long cards, and the size and shape of the I/O cutout on the back, all of which fits in about 10 pages. All the same, these are essential parts of the spec, and one of the things they say is that nothing is supposed to stick out the bottom of a board. So those rear connectors are non-compliant, and I'm curious what's going to become of that. Are they going to roll it into the spec, or give it a new name, or will the whole initiative just peter out after a year and get forgotten? It'll be interesting to find out, but at any rate, this sort of thing is rare, making it an exception that proves the rule. It's safe to say with a high degree of certainty that ATX is ATX across literally tens of thousands of motherboards and cases, and that is remarkable. Now, I've been conscious for most of this history. I've watched countless boards come and go, and the idea that they're all totally intercompatible is fascinating to me, but also kind of boring when it comes down to it, because it is mostly just a mechanical standard. In concept, it's neat that you can put an i7 14th gen into a beige Gateway 2000 case, but the shine wears off pretty quickly. If you've seen one sleeper, you've seen them all. So while I kind of adore ATX, there really isn't that much to study about it since it's virtually never changed. Recently, however, I've been exploring the time period just before ATX, when computers had no standards at all. See, ATX first appeared 14 years into the PC's lifespan, yet it was the first actual specification for the platform. In that whole time, there had never been any kind of standard for motherboard and chassis design. Everything smaller than that was well defined, like add-on card dimensions and parallel port signaling. IBM themselves published specs for all that stuff because they wanted you to build your own hardware, but only as long as it was a peripheral. Accessories were fine because they plugged into PCs, making the platform more valuable. IBM just didn't want anyone building a PC from scratch. Now, as we all know, third-party vendors didn't care about that, and a massive market of clone machines had sprung up anyway by the mid-80s. But nobody in that market had the authority to publish specs, so every vendor just had to figure it out from scratch. The only common element they could refer to was the IBM PC itself, so throughout the 80s, a ton of clones were just what they sound like. Perfect copies of the PC, nearly indistinguishable from the real thing. For reference, here's an IBM 5150, the original personal computer that you could have bought in 1981. And it has an incredibly distinct design by the standards of the era. Most notably, it's a hell of a lot bigger than any other home computer you could get. An Apple II would fit comfortably inside this thing, and most other machines, like the VIC-20, would just about fit inside an Apple II. So the PC was enormous by contemporary standards. To be fair, though, the biggest reason for that was the built-in floppy drives. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure anything else had that other than the TRS-80 Model 3, which also had a built-in keyboard and monitor, making it one of, if not the earliest all-in-one computer. So let's just not count that. If the PC hadn't included space for the drives, however, I suspect it would have been a fraction the size, because the actual circuitry in here isn't really all that impressive. Here's the actual motherboard, the heart of the machine, and it's not that big. It's only about 8.5 by 12 inches. It's a tiny bit bigger than a standard US sheet of paper. I know you can't see the whole thing because of the disk drive, but here's a very similar board to give you an idea. It's kind of on the small side compared to this enormous case, sort of just rattling around loose in there almost. Kind of seems underwhelming for the device that kicked off one of the biggest industries in history. But here's the thing. If I'm honest, this isn't really a complete PC because this motherboard doesn't include video hardware or a disk controller. You kind of need both of those to do anything. So to make this useful, you need to install some add-in cards, and obviously there has to be vertical space for those to live in. This is another big part of why the PC is so big. Had IBM built those basic components into the motherboard, I think they could have made the whole thing fit in a C64-sized case, but since they didn't, the PC ended up with an inadvertently iconic design. In addition to looking extremely businesslike in a very 80s cocaine way, the IBM PC was so big that if you entered a room containing one, you definitely saw it. This thing couldn't get buried under papers like a VIC-20. And what's remarkable to me is that when the clone market spun up, they chose to copy this iconic look unchanged. For a long time, I didn't know this. Like, I knew that PCs got cloned, but I assumed the vendors had the sense and decency to make their machines look at least a little different. No, this is what a typical early clone looked like, and I'm still shocked that IBM didn't have an easier time shutting these companies down. I mean, work-alikes are one thing, but this borders on counterfeiting. Side by side, if you didn't have the badge to go on, could you tell which one of these is real? There's no way. And surely that was grounds for litigation just based on the risk of consumer confusion, but I digress. The important thing is that this sort of clone was at one end of a spectrum, where vendors stuck rigidly to IBM's designs. Not all the machines looked exactly like the PC. Some had unique aesthetics on the outside, but the vast majority looked identical inside. If you bought a clone in 84 or 85, when the concept of the 100% compatible was new, it almost certainly had a plain old 4.7 megahertz CPU and a motherboard that you'd be hard-pressed to tell apart from the IBM original. In fact, I'd go so far as to guess that most boards in pre-built clones would have fit into a standard PC case. But it was certainly true once vendors started selling components a la carte. By early 85, you could buy a motherboard or a case by themselves, and those parts had to fit together sight unseen. That meant that everything had to use the same dimensions, and the only common reference was the PC itself. So it became a standard, however informal, and lots of vendors stuck to it rigidly. But then there was the other end of the spectrum. Many clone makers were willing to deviate from IBM's designs, and a good example is actually the machine that started it all, the Compaq Portable. It's universally regarded as the product that truly ignited the PC clone market by offering full compatibility with PC software through a reverse-engineered BIOS, but that was the only thing it had in common with the PC. Otherwise, the Portable was a totally unique design. It accepted standard add-on cards, and it was functionally the same, but its board and case were totally proprietary designs. And not long after it hit the market, other vendors started offering machines that, while not usually portable, were still a lot smaller than IBM's. One of the earlier examples I found was the 1985 ITT Extra, which is clearly a fraction the size of a typical PC. So we can imagine they had to engineer a custom board to achieve that. And then, of course, there were machines that changed the PC's actual functionality. This board here is actually called a Turbo XT. That is to say, this is a faster version of the board that came in the direct follow-up to the PC, the PC XT. So this has an 8 megahertz CPU rather than just 4.7 megahertz. And even by late 84, these were incredibly popular. So the braver vendors definitely weren't married to the PC's design, but they were all definitely still paying attention to IBM. Because another thing 1984 brought was the PC's long-awaited follow-up, the PC AT. That was a tremendous breath of fresh air. The PC had languished basically unchanged for 3 years at this point. IBM had put out the XT, but it was an extremely minimal upgrade. The AT, on the other hand, radically redesigned the machine, switching from an 8088 to a 286 CPU, doubling the clock speed, introducing a 16-bit bus, and adding a real-time clock that also stored system settings. This was a huge improvement, and of course the clone market picked up on it immediately. It did take a while for AT clones to appear, probably due to high parts cost and lack of software to take advantage of the new CPU, but they did show up in droves and stuck around for a very long time. So I thought I had a good example of an AT clone to show you, but I've since realized this thing is a lot newer than I thought. It's from like 1989. And as it turns out, I could have known that just from looking at it, because just like the early PC clones, if you bought a third-party AT in 85, 86, or even early 87, most of them looked exactly like IBM's design. And once again, the hardware inside was pretty similar as well. That's why this isn't a good specimen. So part of the problem is that this thing has some very specialized add-on hardware in it, including a super rare and fragile 386 upgrade that I'm not going to risk pulling out. But if we rotate this around here, you can probably see that the actual motherboard down there isn't a whole lot bigger than the one in the original PC. In fact, I think it's a little bit longer this way, but it's about the same width. And the thing is, if this was an early AT clone, that wouldn't be the case. This is a contemporary clone of the PC AT motherboard, and we don't even need to put our reference board on top of it. You can tell it is much, much bigger than the original PC motherboard. All the upgrades IBM made in the AT added a ton of complexity, and at this point they weren't really into making custom chips. So the original AT board was jam-packed with basic logic ICs, forcing them to make it absolutely gigantic. Seriously, I don't know if it comes across on camera. This thing is comically large. It's like one of the biggest circuit boards I've ever handled. It's really a very wasteful design, but a lot of vendors cloned it basically unchanged, just as they had with the PC, so the AT motherboard became another de facto standard. And this is kind of frustrating because while the original PC motherboard was really not a bad role model for system design, I think the AT board kind of was. I'm no electrical engineer, but I know a little bit, and I'm fairly certain this design could have been shrunk down tremendously by integrating a lot of these simple gate chips into an ASIC or even a ULA. That's the strategy Sinclair used for the ZX Spectrum, which was not only one of the cheapest computers ever made, but also came out 5 years earlier. So even when the AT was new, IBM probably could have eliminated a lot of this clutter. At this point in time, however, most clone makers were still hanging on IBM's every word, so they were sticking very close to their original designs. It seems, however, that at some point, Big Blue stopped being the target that everyone was aiming for. It began with simple aesthetic changes. Take PCs Limited, for instance, later to be known as Dell. They'd been making perfect AT lookalikes up through 85 and 86. Then, in 1987, they changed their styling completely. Same goes for other vendors, like whoever made this thing. This looks nothing like a PC AT. Now, that may partly have been because IBM had started rattling their sabers again over trademarks and whatnot, but nobody really took those threats seriously. Still, I imagine a lot of vendors started thinking, hey, why not start putting some distance between us and them? We make unique products, so why not have them look unique instead of just an obvious cookie-cutter copy? Because that's the thing. By this point, making a machine that looked exactly like a PC AT was kind of misleading because the functionality of clones was changing as well. By 1987, there were a ton of portables and even laptops that wildly altered the PC's design, but even the average clone wasn't really much of a clone anymore. Most had overclocked CPUs, some had more efficient zero-weight state memory, and then, of course, there was the 386. IBM screwed up with the 386. They didn't think Intel's new CPU was going to work out, so they ignored it. And in that vacuum, Compaq was able to release the first 386-based PC compatible, the Desk Pro 386, which hit the market in 1986 and promptly became a rip-roaring success. Plenty of other vendors released 386 clones in its wake, but IBM only managed to get one out halfway through the following year, because instead of focusing on the upcoming new generation of computing hardware, they were busy trying to make the PS2 happen. This is a whole separate topic, but in summary, the PS2 was an IBM initiative to retake the market with a new breed of PC, which more or less failed and maybe even backfired. I get the feeling that it actually damaged their market share and maybe even reputation, but at a minimum, it just didn't sell that well, and certainly didn't grab back all the market share they'd lost to the clones. This, I think, is all widely acknowledged. A personal observation of mine, however, is that the PS2 series didn't really seem to get cloned itself. And of course, this was intentional. Most PS2 models were built around the microchannel architecture, or MCA, a bus that IBM had developed partly as an improvement on ISA, but partly to give them something patentable so they could charge clone vendors a license fee to copy it and sue them if they didn't pay. And this strategy was certainly effective. There were few, if any, MCA-compatible machines sold without a license, but there were also just very few of them, period. I think the consumer public didn't really see a pressing need for a new bus. They also didn't love IBM very much by this point, and they did love the clone market. The PC's rip-roaring success happened largely because of its open standards, so nobody was interested in buying into a walled garden, certainly not after 6 years of freedom. So MCA is almost certainly the reason, if you had to pick one, that nobody made a carbon copy clone of the PS2. Now, for what it's worth, it did have a lot of other hardware features that did get copied, like the smaller keyboard port, the standard mouse controller, the 3.5-inch floppy drive, and let's not forget VGA, a monumental upgrade to the PC's graphics that might not have come for years if not for the PS2. But in terms of general aesthetics and design, the PS2 really seemed to stand alone. Even the companies that lifted all those other features didn't make anything that looked like their progenitors. Now, I have seen it asserted that the PS2 was responsible for popularizing the tower-style PC, since several models in the series used that form factor, but I have some beef with that. Upright floor stands had been around for years, and the desk-side design had always been popular in workstations, so I think it was only a matter of time before it made it into the PC world. And even the tower-style machines that did show up on the market weren't, say, limited to 3.5-inch drives like the PS2 Model 60. Certainly none of them lifted the PS2's styling. So, in other words, there aren't any clones I'm aware of that you'd look at and say, damn, that's a PS2 with the serial numbers filed off. So it really seems like after 1984, after the PC-AT, the clone market chose to split off and go it alone, developing a new identity for themselves instead of copying IBM's every move. Cool. Great. Glad we had this talk. I'm sure we've put that topic to bed. Let's move on to new business. A few weeks ago, I found myself asking one of those questions, the sort I so often run into, that seem simple at first but lead me down a garden path, eventually to places I never expected to go. The question was, where did the standard PC power supply come from? This has always bothered me, partly because the mount pattern is really odd. The screw holes are arranged mostly in a rectangle, but there's one hole that's offset down and to the left. Never understood why that is, but well, thinking about it now, it does make it impossible to mount the supply upside down, so maybe that's all there is to it. But who is the arbiter of that? Who decided what upside down was, and when did people start caring about it? Who decided this was the universal solution? Well, this is an ATX supply, so you might think it was Intel, drafters of the ATX standard. But for years before ATX existed, PCs had used supplies like this, which have the exact same dimensions and mount pattern, but use AT-style connectors and have hard on-off switches instead of soft power. So the real question is, where'd these come from? And the answer, as far as I can tell, is that they just appeared overnight circa 1990. They weren't there, and then they were. If we look at this ad from a power supply vendor published in 1989, they offer a whole bunch of funky looking supplies, but none of them look like this. Several of these are proprietary to Compaq and other big name system builders, but the standard supply of this era was that guy right there. If you bought any PC made between 81 and 89, it most likely used something that looked just like this, because it's what IBM used in the original PC. Naturally. Every part of the personal computer became an element of the industry standard, but this one was maybe the most unfortunate because it was comically oversized and inconvenient. You see, this supply, made in like 1997, puts out 230 watts, which we would consider quaint and mild by modern standards. And nowadays, I don't think you could buy an ATX supply that puts out less than 500. But the original PC unit, which is about 3 times the volume, I think, this produces all of 63. Now, I'm not saying IBM could have done better at the time. I'm sure switch mode supplies were in their infancy in 1981, but every aspect of the PC ossified instantly. So even though power technology improved rapidly, the PC chassis was set in stone, and every supply had to fit this outline. I mean, if you were a big manufacturer constructing a machine from scratch, you could get a smaller power supply custom made, and some did, but those were proprietary, which is bad for obvious reasons, and you had to be pretty big to afford that. So up through 1989, most OEMs and DIY builders stuck to the original PC design because it was the only thing that was broadly agreed upon. Then, all of a sudden, in 1990, these smaller supplies just show up, with no fanfare and no explanation. I wasn't able to find a single magazine article that announced this new form factor, or put a name to it, or even mentioned that it existed in opposition to an older style. And that seems really peculiar to me because magazines were so starved for news that they'd report on just about anything. A sea change like this going completely unmentioned is bizarre, and it's particularly odd because these things were a massive pain point. No pun intended. They had needed to be improved for a decade, and not just because of their size. This new standard, you see, also did away with the god-awful power switch. The standard PC supply had this big red paddle permanently attached to the side, and everything based on it had the exact same switch in the same position. So they all had to mount in one specific spot in the back of your case, and to turn your machine on and off, you had to reach all the way back on the side. It was awkward, it limited where you could put your PC, and it made tower designs much less practical. The new design, however, used a much smaller latching push button on the end of a cable coming out the back of the supply, so the case designer could mount it wherever they wanted. Put it on the front, high, low, on the side, on the back, anywhere the cable would reach. And if you did want a rocker or a paddle, you could have that too. You just swap out the switch. It was a much more flexible design, so you'd think this would have been celebrated. Instead, it's hard to even prove that it happened. I just had to stare at ads for hours to figure out exactly when the switchover occurred, and the only way I could do that is by just seeing when the power switch moved. But it had definitely happened by early 1990, I'm sure of that, and it was almost simultaneous across vendors. There were a few stragglers, but all of a sudden a tremendous number of them were using this new design. Now that means they were all following someone's lead. It's just very hard to figure out who. Trying to chase this down got me pretty much nowhere, and I think even gave me some bad info. For instance, an early version of the ATX spec addresses the power supply's origins as a modified PS2 supply. Now this is odd because by 1995, the PS2 was long dead and irrelevant, and it's also not clear which one they'd be referring to. The PS2 series consisted of a bunch of totally different machines with different supplies. None had the ATX mount pattern, and they all had integrated switches. So this doesn't really seem to explain anything, and I had no other leads, so I gave up on the question and switched to another one that had also been perplexing me. This is a baby AT motherboard, and I don't know where these came from either. The term was universally applied to PC boards and cases from the late 80s up to the mid 90s, but again, it seemed to just appear overnight with no explanation. In 1986, magazines make no mention of it. In 87, they're all referring to it as if you already know what it is. And the same goes on Usenet. People just show up in 87 asking where to buy these and how to use them. One post refers to them as a product that's appeared in recent months, but gives no further detail on where it appeared or how it was announced. nobody seems to know or care where these came from. The only real claim I've found about Baby AT's origins says that it was derived from the XT286, and that's a machine I vaguely knew existed but have never really had a reason to think about. It was another IBM product, introduced in 1986 and presumably pretty short-lived since the PS2 was about to come out. But it was apparently exactly what it sounds like, a PC XT style machine equipped with a 286 processor. And of course, the simplest way to build that would be to just stick an AT motherboard in an XT case, but as we saw earlier, that board was so big that it would have run into the power supply. Plus, miniaturization had come a long way by that point, and there was just no need to waste all that board material, so IBM designed a new motherboard with the same dimensions as the XT, but sporting AT-style hardware. Supposedly, according to a few vague tertiary sources, this general design was later chosen as the basis for Baby AT. And I can't tell if this is actually true or just the result of a long telephone game. Even if it is true, though, where'd it come from? Who chose the XT286 as a model? How did the standard spread? Who gave it that name? And what does it actually specify? Nobody seems to know, as far as I can tell. And one theory I have about this is that since the majority of PC design was being done in Taiwan at this point, all the manufacturers over there just traded the spec around amongst themselves and it simply never made its way to the US. Maybe that's true, maybe not. Either way, I'm not sure we'll ever know, but I don't really trust anything I've found so far. For instance, I don't really buy the XT286 connection because there's no real difference between that and a plain old XT board. Some sources say it was 13 inches long instead of 12, but clone boards have always varied by an inch or two in either dimension, as did Baby AT boards, so that doesn't really mean anything. And otherwise, there just isn't much to nail it down. If you put this board next to an XT286, they don't resemble each other at all. The only common elements are the screw holes, the power connector, the card slots, and the keyboard port, and none of those things had changed since the original XT. I can't really find any distinct features about these boards, so I'm just not convinced that Baby AT ever existed as a standard, de facto or otherwise. More likely, I think the market just got used to the comically oversized AT boards for a couple years, and then when the inevitable miniaturization brought them back down to the old XT dimensions, people needed a term for it. But with all that said, this change to smaller boards definitely seems to have happened around 1987. Not every vendor followed at once. I mean, the AT board I showed you earlier is made in like 1989, I think. But the Baby ones certainly started appearing en masse around that point, and they continued selling for a whole decade well into the era of mass PC adoption in the 90s, when the design started getting very long in the tooth. In the fullness of time, Baby AT lasted through about 4 generations of hardware. It started out with 10 MHz 286s with ISA slots, it middled with dual socket 200 MHz Pentium Pros with PCI, and it ended with 500 MHz Pentium 3s with AGP. So it's no surprise that people's demands changed over its lifespan, and one of the biggest had to do with onboard peripherals. Most of IBM's machines, after all, had nothing built in. The PC, XT, and AT motherboards housed a CPU, RAM, and some very low-level support components, like a DRAM refresh controller, without which the machine literally couldn't function. Everything else you had to add yourself, from a video card and disk controller to parallel and serial interfaces, and those alone ate up as much as 4 expansion slots. And let me just point out that the original PC only had 5 slots. It was a decency on their part that the keyboard port was built in, but if you wanted a mouse and didn't have a serial port available, you had to buy a special bus mouse card, which took up yet another slot. And prior to the AT, if you wanted your computer to know what time it was, you had to buy a real-time clock, which ate up another slot. So as you can imagine, it was pretty common to see PCs with every slot in use. And the market responded to this as best it could. A very popular product were combo cards that let one slot host many different interfaces, but they were big and expensive, so not everyone could afford them. There were also some bizarre solutions, like the real-time clocks that hung off the side of a slot and shared it with another device, but as far as I can tell, not many people took advantage of those. And while the PC XT added 2 more slots to the motherboard, that was only a thin attempt to paper over an absurd problem. Maybe it was justifiable for the PC to have no onboard peripherals in 1981, but by the middle of the decade it was getting increasingly ridiculous. All the same, IBM didn't fix it in 84 or 85 or 86 when most vendors were copying their work line for line, so it just stayed stupid. Fast forward to the 90s though, and things suddenly get a lot better. This baby AT board, for instance, has built-in serial, parallel, and mouse ports, and some even had integrated video and USB. But you might ask, where is all this stuff? All the board seems to have is a keyboard port. And that's the big problem with baby AT. By the 90s, the need to integrate these basic, necessary components was indisputable, but board vendors were essentially still using the original XT case design from way back in 1983, and it had no accommodations for extra ports. These two boards, from two completely different generations, use essentially the same layout. And in both cases, the back edge of the board that lays against the rear panel of the case is dominated by card slots. There's only enough room here for a keyboard port, and maybe one more, but since all the existing cases didn't have a cutout there for any other ports, you couldn't really do much with that. Now, they could have made the board wider to accommodate more ports and then made custom chassis for it, but they'd have to convince people to buy those chassis. All the existing ones were stuck with this width because there was a power supply right here, so there wasn't a whole lot they could do. Now, this is a little bit of a spoiler, but since this is an ATX appreciation video, if you're wondering how we eventually fixed this problem, it was by simply rotating the board. Literally, per the spec, an ATX board is described as baby AT, but rotated 90 degrees. I can show you this. If we put a baby AT and ATX board next to each other, you can see the dimensions are largely the same, but they've rotated the card slots 90 degrees. This allows the long edge of the board to lay against the back of the case, and that gives them a lot more room for ports. Unfortunately, that requires completely re-engineering the chassis, which was out of the question when baby AT was introduced. So, how did they solve this back then? This is an assembled baby AT machine from the 90s. And if we take a look at the back, we find we have a bunch of ports, but it's kind of a mess. We've got our PS2 mouse and a parallel port down here. Up here we've got two different size serial ports and VGA, but these are all installed in knockouts. You can see there's a little metal flap on this one that hasn't been used yet. We'll open this thing up and I'll show you what's going on inside. So here's the deal. Each of these ports is just a bare plug attached to a ribbon cable. And to install one, you have to knock out the metal blank on the back, bolt the plug into place, and then plug it into the motherboard where there's just a bunch of pin headers down here, which you can't even see, sort of making my point for me. This approach certainly has its pros and cons. It means that boards could have lots of peripherals built in without a major change to chassis design because case manufacturers could put lots and lots of these knockouts back here, and you just use the ones you needed and leave the other ones intact. It didn't require you to change anything about how the motherboard or the case was designed to add new peripherals. The problem is that, well, you had a million ribbons snaking around inside the case to poorly labeled, often unkeyed pin headers, and this led to nearly a decade of miserably messy computers. I mean, gosh, just look at this thing. This is a pretty basic system, and it's still kind of a disaster inside. And it got worse over time because, well, at first, in like the late 80s, everything you might have wanted to add, like serial and parallel, used these D-sub connectors. So cases just had a bunch of D-sub knockouts. But eventually, onboard mouse ports became commonplace, so you either needed a case with a special cutout for a mini DID plug, or a bracket to fit one into a DB25 port. And if you had neither, then you ended up with one of these, a dummy bracket that installed into your card cage. And the same thing happened when USB came along. So there were a lot of machines from like late 1996 that had 2 or more card slots blocked by these big wasteful brackets. This obviously sucked, but it was unavoidable because assuming baby AT was truly a standard, it was one that originated in the late 80s. These problems couldn't have been addressed because nobody was quite ready to start building in all this functionality back then. Except, of course, that that's not really true. Someone was ready, and that someone was IBM. This is a PS2 Model 30, and it's a very intriguing machine. As I mentioned earlier, IBM developed the MCA bus partly to make the PS2 harder to clone. But even Big Blue realized that putting all their bets on MCA was a bad idea, so there were a few machines in the lineup that actually used a standard ISA bus, including this one. And from a few feet back, that makes this machine look pretty regressive. You see, several of the initial models in the PS2 lineup used 286 CPUs, and combining that with an ISA bus would mean you pretty much just have a rehashed PC AT, a design from 3 years earlier that looked woefully outdated next to the new 386s. But the Model 30 was even worse than that. It used a plain 8086 CPU running at 8 megahertz. That's right, IBM's big idea for stealing back the market was to sell a Turbo XT. You know, the thing you could get for $400 on clearance in the back of PC Magazine, except theirs started at $1,600 or $2,300 if you wanted the hard drive. So IBM, as usual, didn't seem to know what planet they were on, but despite this, the Model 30 had a number of interesting things going for it. For one, it was very compact. I don't know if it's obvious from the screen here, but I think this thing is like that big. It's really tiny, which is surprising for IBM, who up to this point only made their machines bigger and bigger. This one's really quite diminutive. And if we take a look at the back, we find that it also has a ton of built-in ports. First, we have the new miniature 6-pin plug for the keyboard, then another one for the new built-in mouse controller. We also have serial and parallel ports, and finally, the built-in video, which isn't actually VGA, unfortunately. It's a cut-down version called MCGA, which is really kind of a bummer, but it's still a huge improvement over anything that had come before, so we gotta give it credit. And in any case, this is a tremendous amount of built-in functionality, especially for such a small package. It was only possible, though, because the PS2's components are all totally proprietary. The motherboard is custom-made for this machine and won't fit in any other, which isn't a shocker because IBM didn't care about the PC as a standard. They never had. They hadn't designed the parts to be interchangeable, let alone upgradable. No third party was ever supposed to make a motherboard or a case, and each of their machines had been incompatible with the last. And why not? They saw this as their product to do with as they pleased. Breaking compatibility didn't bother them in the least, and it was really convenient. For some of these machines, the solutions were really simple. In the Model 50, they just made the board wider to accommodate the extra ports. Simple as that. But with the Model 30, they did something interesting. To keep the machine small, they actually figured out how to fit the cards and ports into the same space. And you can see from the outside how they did it. On a normal PC, the expansion cards all sit perpendicular to the motherboard, but these slots are parallel to the board. And if we take a peek inside, you can see why. The cards don't plug into the motherboard directly. Instead, they slot into a riser, which rotates them 90 degrees. This allows the bottommost card to sit an inch above the motherboard, leaving room for the new ports. It's honestly brilliant. So of course, the whole industry ripped it off. The thing I said earlier about clone vendors not paying attention to IBM's designs after 1984 just isn't true, because starting somewhere around 89 and running well up into the 90s, tons of machines were made based on this general layout. Here's one from Compaq, one from DEC, one from Gateway, one from Acer. I could put another 50 or 80 on the screen, but I'd run out of room and breath, and I think you get the point. Just at a glance, you could tell these were heavily inspired by the Model 30. I'd even go so far as to say, based on my observations of how slowly the clone makers innovated back then, that these wouldn't exist if IBM's machine hadn't. And yet, I've never met anyone who referred to the Model 30 as the progenitor of any kind of trend. I think you'd agree this seems weird. But it's probably because these were all pre-built machines, and the kind of nerds who know the gritty details of PC hardware tend to focus on parts they can buy off the shelf and cobble together into their own custom battle stations, rather than the machines sold as black boxes at Circuit City or Costco. So I think this connection just flew under most collectors' radars. All the same though, if you are a collector, there's a good chance you own one or two of these machines and just never noticed the similarities. In fact, once I noticed them, I went digging through my collection and realized I had several machines that fit the bill. Here's one that I got a few months ago. It's a Dell Netplex 425S/P. It's kind of an odd bird. The machine itself isn't really that unusual. It was first sold around 1993. It has a 25 megahertz 46SX, shipped with about 4 megs of RAM, a 120 meg hard drive, and built-in VESA local bus video. So it's really straight down the middle for its age and price, which was $1,300 to $1,800. Really, it's a totally normal office PC. But for some reason, Dell sold this as a network node. And I have to admit, I have no idea what that means. It seems like an incredibly vague term, and I couldn't find any contemporary sources defining it more precisely. I mean, surely a network node would just be a machine participating in a network, which anything could. So what makes this special? I don't know. I read every bit of copy in the ad and nothing made it clearer. Dell seem emphatic that this is a real node, not a pseudo quasi wannabe near node. But they don't define what that is, and nothing about the machine seems remotely unusual compared to any typical PC of the era. You could guess that they're focusing on like a diskless net boot concept, but they all shipped with sizable hard drives, and a network card wasn't even standard hardware. You had to pay extra to have one installed. At that point, you could have just installed it in any other PC. So the whole thing baffles me, but I bought it anyway because it's a cute, incredibly tiny 486, and I haven't been disappointed in that sense. I put some ancient Debian on it. It runs like crap. I love it. And if we flip it around and take a look at the back, hey, sure enough, we got a bunch of built-in ports and horizontal slots. Let's take a look at the inside. Pseudo wannabe near node. And with the case off, you can see we've got the motherboard and the riser card, just like the Model 30. It's not an identical design by any means, but it's definitely similar in concept. Likewise, let me fetch my Packard Bell. These two machines look completely different on the front. They're not even the same size, but if we spin them around, we've got horizontal slots and a row of ports. Looks remarkably similar. And how about this cannon here? This one also looks unique on the front, but we flip it around and we've got horizontal slots and a row of ports. So it seems like I made my point, right? Clearly a bunch of clone vendors saw the riser idea, realized how convenient it was, and decided to copy it. And the video could end here. Just some interesting trivia that suggests IBM was relevant longer than I thought. Cool story, have a nice day. But by this point, you may have noticed something deeper going on. Clearly, these aren't Model 30 clones per se. Like they're obviously not cookie cutter copies like we saw back at the PC and AT days. They're quite different, and yet all three are extremely similar to each other, close to identical in some ways. Like these two machines have the exact same port layout, and all three put their ports in the same area on the back. This is way too similar to be a coincidence. There's no way that three independent designs, vaguely informed by IBM's machine, converged this closely. They're clearly based on some far more specific standard, and I know what it is. It's not even hard to find out what it is. There's a wiki page on it, for Christ's sake. I just, for some reason, in all my years, have never read it, or if I did, I never internalized how it connected to anything I had actually seen. The standard was named LPX, and just as the wiki page says, it was developed by Western Digital of all people. That might seem odd at first, but you have to remember that while WD was a huge name in hard drives starting in the 90s, that was only because they'd bought a hard drive manufacturer in 1988. Up to that point, they were diversified into lots of different markets, so it's really not surprising that they made motherboards for a bit. Here, for instance, is a Western Digital 386 board with LPX in the model number. And that's where the paper trail ends. I've been able to prove absolutely nothing beyond this fact. Like, to be clear, I have no doubt that LPX existed, that WD made it, and that it was commonplace. I've found references to it in multiple reliable sources, including documentation for an Intel motherboard that makes it clear this was a widely accepted spec. But it doesn't say anything about the spec. It's impossible to find any details on what LPX was, and virtually every reference I found was published more than a decade after it supposedly came out. And also, they all suck. Like, all the references on Wikipedia are to general-purpose PC reference books published in 2000 or later, so in addition to being super vague, they also don't cite any sources. They claim WD put this thing into circulation around 1987, but I don't buy that. You're going to tell me the Model 30 hit the market in June, and within a few months, this company had developed a complete standard based on it, but not cloning it? Like, it's one thing to just duplicate a machine. I could imagine doing that fairly quickly, but to engineer a totally new design inspired by it, that takes time. So I find the 1987 claim pretty dubious without evidence, especially because there's no contemporary mentions of it. LPX doesn't come up in any magazines, and it doesn't come up on Usenet. And to be fair, part of that is because it was clearly an OEM-only standard. You couldn't go out and buy an LPX board or case. They were all made custom for pre-built systems. So naturally, there wasn't much chatter from the DIY scene. Like I said earlier, nerds don't like to talk about pre-built PCs nearly as much as ones built on open standards. But the thing is, a lot of people on Usenet back in the 80s and 90s worked for system builders, and they posted tons of inside baseball online. So it's tough for me to accept that among all the people who worked for Compaq and Dell who were constantly spilling tea on Usenet, not one of them ever had cause to mention this. Like, why would they keep it to themselves? There's no reason. You'd think someone, somewhere, would have written down some kind of loose summary of the standard, but nobody did that I can find. So while LPX definitely existed, and I'm certain I have 3 LPX machines in front of me, I don't actually know what it specified. So let's just pretend we're a clone vendor and try to reverse engineer it. Let's go back to this Canon that I briefly mentioned. Like the Dell, this is also a 486. It was also made around 93, 94. And just to be clear, I'm certain the two machines were designed by different companies. The Canon isn't at all shy about who made it. Per the motherboard, it was built by Acer. And, well, if they'd made the board in the Dell, I'm sure it would say the same thing. But also, I know they designed the rest of this machine because they sold the exact same case and board under a dozen other names, including their own. And this is a very distinctive design. It's actually toolless. Let me show you how that works. To open this up, we just pull 2 tabs under the faceplate, tilt that up, set it aside. Then we pull these 2 tabs out and shove the top cover backwards till it comes away. Already, this is the fastest disassembly I've ever seen of a computer of this era. Now we can see the motherboard and riser and whatnot. We'll get to those, but we want a clear shot. So we're gonna need the power, the storage, everything like that out of the way. And that's super easy in this machine because this is all one module held in by a single plastic latch. So we pull this, we lift, and the entire thing just comes out as a unit. I'd already released these cables, but you do have to pop those loose. Even the back panel comes off with it. And that leaves us with absolutely nothing other than the motherboard, which we just unplug and lift straight out. Time! I don't think I've ever seen a computer that came apart that fast. Like, man, Acer was on something. This kind of owns. Anyway, there it is. That's an LPX motherboard. There's not much to look at. It's about 8.5 by 11, maybe a little bit smaller. So again, roughly the same dimensions as the original PC or XT motherboard. And we've got a single slot here in the middle for the riser card. Otherwise, it's just usual motherboard components. So for more detail, we're gonna need a second one to find the common elements. So now, let's take the Dell to pieces. Now, this machine's much more conventional, so give me a couple minutes to get it all apart. All right, and just like that, we are free. Shove that to one side. All right, so here's our 2 boards side by side, and okay, they're a little different, but they're pretty clearly based on the same standards. This one is longer than the other, but it's exactly the same width, and all the screw holes are in exactly the same locations. They both have the riser slot, and even the hard drive and floppy connectors are in roughly the same spots. So I'm guessing those were in the spec. These also both use the mini DIN keyboard and mouse connectors borrowed from the PS2 family, and all their ports are arranged along the back edge of the board where they fit into a rectangular cutout on the back of the case. Now, to fit that cutout, the ports are masked off using this custom cut piece of metal, and that makes this sort of a forerunner to ATX. See if we get the Packard Bell back out here. If you compare these side by side, these two boards happen to have all the same ports in the same order, while the Packard Bell has a totally different layout. But since all the ports fit in the same space, these should all work in any LPX case. And a vendor could get more adventurous than this. They could have swapped out a serial port for a pair of USBs or a parallel port for a set of audio jacks, and all they'd have to do is make a different mask. No changes to the back panel would be necessary. So this certainly isn't as flexible as ATX, but it's on its way to the right idea. The question, however, is how far did they get? Are these parts truly interchangeable? Suppose you got two machines, one with a dead board but a pristine case, and a second from another manufacturer with a good board but a trashed case. Could you kit bash them into one technically mismatched but much better looking specimen? Well, the answer seems to be maybe. The reason I bought that Canon machine is because when I set it next to my Dell and gave it a good stare, I convinced myself that the two boards were so similar that I could definitely swap them between machines. This isn't to say there weren't any hurdles. For one thing, the I/O shields are totally different. The Canon has a much longer one because the case has a much longer cutout that runs all the way from one end to the other. So these shields would never fit, but the ports themselves are identical, and the shields can be detached by unscrewing all the standoffs. So swapping them shouldn't be an issue. Also, one case has a 3-slot riser while the other has 4. So, well, there's no way to fit this into the Dell case, it's just too tall. But that shouldn't be a problem, right? I'll just swap the boards and then keep the matching riser for that case. Simple, right? Okay, so this is the Canon board, and we want to put on the I/O shield from the Dell. Well, that fits perfectly. We don't need to put all these in. Let's just do a couple. All right, let's see if we can put that in the case. It's a little fiddly, but this case wasn't exactly meant to be worked in. It's really fiddly, jeez. Is this running into something? I don't think so. Oh, you know what it might be? The Canon board has these little spacers instead of using screws for all the holes. I wonder if that's keeping it from seating. Oh, that feels a lot cleaner. There we go. All right, so the board is clearly in. You can't tell from the outside that anything's changed. So let's just go ahead and try and plug in the riser. Here's the one that fits the Dell, and wait a minute. Hang on. Something's amiss. If we take the two risers and compare them side by side, they're completely different. Like, they look similar for a moment, but then, yeah, those are completely different and clearly incompatible. Even if we were to line up the screw holes here, you could see the left edge of the connector isn't the same. So this can never work. And I suspect it's Acer's fault. If you take a look at the Dell riser here, this is just a straight standard ISA slot. And I've seen a number of other LPX machines that also used a riser that looked just like this. In fact, the Intel manual I referred to earlier said its riser conformed to LPX standards, so maybe the spec actually defined this and Acer just chose not to conform. But I can't be sure. Maybe most machines were identical, maybe most had subtle differences. I can only find out by gathering up a bunch of LPX systems and comparing them, and what little of that I've been able to do hasn't gone so well. Because in addition to the Dell Canon situation, we also have problems with the Packard Bell. This machine is also definitely based on LPX, but for some reason they decided to put this little metal bridge here between the PS2 ports and the rest. But they're still using an I/O shield behind that, so it seems completely redundant. It just means that if you tried to install a different board, the standoff screws would run into that little bridge unless you dremeled it out. It's almost like they deliberately wanted to make the case incompatible, just out of spite. But on the other hand, this board uses a totally ordinary looking ISA riser, which up until now I've not had a chance to put next to the Dell. What do we think? We think it's gonna work? We think it's gonna fit? No. Well, sort of. The bolt holes are in a different place, but no, actually, Actually, yeah, the entire thing, the whole thing is wrong, because if this lines up with that, then this doesn't line up with that. So, well, shit. I had a bit in the script here. I was so certain that these were compatible that I was going to put this board in there, but obviously that doesn't work, so whoops. Well, that says a lot about LPX, I guess. Well, where do we go from here? You can tell that LPX could have been an interchangeable standard, and well, it must have been to some extent, because there was actually a company back in the 2000s selling aftermarket boards for LPX cases. How successful and compatible these were, I couldn't tell you, but seems like someone thought it was likely to work. And I mean, I'd be surprised if a large number of LPX machines weren't compatible. It's probably just that I managed to get a bunch of weird ones. But, well, that's sort of the point. What's even the value of a standard if you can't assume the parts are interchangeable? Well, I think I can answer my own question there, and it has a lot to do with this being an OEM-only spec. You see, at this point in time, clone PCs were almost universally made by companies in Taiwan who could engineer a whole system from the ground up, but couldn't market it effectively overseas. Meanwhile, there were a ton of US-based companies that had brand recognition here, but didn't want to pay US wages to have boards designed. So, the American companies, who we refer to as OEMs, went to the Taiwanese manufacturers, known as ODMs, and basically said, hey, make us a machine with a 46 CPU, 4 RAM slots, VESA local bus graphics, and room for 2 optical drives. Put a nice faceplate on it, and ship us 150,000 of them. And that's probably where the conversation ended. Packard Bell likely had very little influence on the design process of this machine beyond the basic specs, and they probably didn't much care what was inside as long as it was reliable and performed as advertised. In fact, they didn't even care if the guts were completely identical to their competition. Believe me, a lot of PCs in the 90s were literally the same thing with a different faceplate. Of course, there'd always be the occasional request for customizations, so ODMs couldn't get away with shipping literally the same design to every customer, but they had a very strong incentive to minimize the cost of modifications, and sticking to some kind of standard made this easier. Specifying the motherboard size, mount holes, card locations, and I/O cutouts meant that lots of tooling could be reused, lots of metrics, their CAD drawings only needed to be slightly modified to accommodate changes. They didn't have to go back to the drawing board, right? And the end result was this, a ton of machines with nearly interchangeable parts or occasionally interchangeable parts. A motherboard from one machine might fit in another, but only if it happened to, and only if the OEM didn't request any major changes. If they did, then compatibility might go out the window completely. For instance, with the Packard Bell, well, obviously we've seen that this riser card doesn't actually fit. But even if it did, behind that, there's a modem module right here. And that modem module depends on a little cutout in the back of the case that isn't there on the Dell or on the Canon. So even though this board probably would fit in there, you'd never be able to use the modem. With that said, I have to imagine that an awful lot of vendors probably didn't request any changes, and their boards probably were interchangeable. You just can't assume this until you try. And to make things worse, there were machines that looked very much like LPX, but weren't. For instance, the Pentium-based Dell GM5133 has the distinctive horizontal slots on the back, but there's no port cutout, and several of the ports are stacked 2 rows high. This case is clearly unique to the board and would fit no other. Dell made lots of machines like this. Compaq made some that look a little closer, but are probably still incompatible, so looks can really be deceiving. And in addition, there are some machines from the Pentium 2 and 3 eras that used NLX, a somewhat similar looking design, but one that was based on an actual published standard that Intel put out circa 1997. NLX also used a riser, but it was a completely different standard, which I suspect wasn't even compatible between different machines, though that's not something I've been able to look into yet. In short, you really can't bet on any 2 machines being compatible without actually checking, and while it seems that LPX was some kind of standard, it's clearly one that vendors deviated from whenever they felt like it, because from their perspective, who would know? The overwhelming majority of consumers never opened up their computers. Most people never even knew this standard existed, and they weren't supposed to. So it's no surprise that it had very little lasting effect on the market. Plenty of LPX machines were sold, but most of its concepts didn't end up sticking. Except, I think, for one. If you start trying to dig up dirt on this standard and you just go and keep going, eventually you might come across a reference to an LPX power supply. It seems they standardized that. And indeed, if we flip these machines around, well, would you look at that? All three power supplies have the modern footprint. In fact, the size of the Dell here is even dictated by the power supply, reaches perfectly from the top to the bottom. And the same would probably be true on the Canon, except this supply was moved up a little to make the port cutout wider, presumably in case an OEM requested a board with extra connectors. And of course, well, this wouldn't seem to mean much, right? Because these machines are from the mid-90s when pretty much every PC was using that style of supply. But check this out. This is an Arch Triumph 286, a PC from 1989, and so far it's the earliest LPX style system I can find, and the earliest I can find using this style of power supply. This, by the way, supports my theory that the standard wasn't really from 87. A 2-year turnaround on cloning the Model 30 sounds much more likely than 6 months, but I digress. If we look at the back, from the bolt holes, you can tell that this has the modern power supply footprint, but there's something interesting. Well, it does have the usual offset hole in the bolt pattern. It also has one that forms a plain rectangle, and the supply that's in there actually fits that layout. Now, this was a revelation to me. I've always felt that somewhere out there had to be an ATX style supply with this screw pattern. I figured the offset bolt had to have been an option, which you'd use if you cared about the orientation, but there'd also have been a rectangular layout that you'd use if you didn't care which way the supply mounted. This seems to confirm my suspicions, and the gratification I felt from finally seeing it was totally unreasonable. It should not have excited me the way it did, but as far as I'm concerned, I've located a missing link in the PC's evolution. I think this is a bridge between the ancient past and the modern era. I suspect that LPX introduced this new power supply layout initially with both screw holes, and then later it dropped one once the power supply became an essential part of the PC's thermal solution, and its orientation thus became very important. If you don't know, by the way, in the earliest versions of ATX, the power supply fan was actually expected to cool the CPU. The past was truly a foreign country. Anyway, all this suggests that we actually owe the design of the ATX power supply, however indirectly, to Western Digital, which is weird. But I think they owe a debt in turn to the PS2 Model 30. Like, don't get me wrong, the Model 30's supply is totally incompatible with anything else. It has a completely unique mount pattern, I think it has a unique power connector, and it even uses a big, stupid built-in power switch for some reason. Like this seems weird to me because IBM custom made these supplies, and they clearly wanted the switch to be on the front of the machine, yet they opted to put it on the supply itself and use a big metal rod connecting from a fake switch on the front to toggle it. I'll admit, my initial response to this was to assume they were smoking some desert cactus, but then I remembered that several other machines I've owned, including this Packard Bell and totally irrelevant designs like the Amiga 3000, do a similar thing using a big plastic rod to press a button on the PSU. So there must be something to it. I don't know, maybe it's some kind of UL certification dodge, but in any case, while there are huge differences between a PS2 supply and the ones we use today, the outer dimensions are supposedly identical. Which makes sense, right? Because when Western Digital were developing LPX, they probably started with that outline because they were cloning the Model 30 after all. They just made some obvious improvements. They gave it a more universal mount standard and replaced the paddle switch with a much more flexible solution. I can't prove this, but it seems likely enough. The thing is, it wouldn't even really matter if it had just been part of LPX. But of course, if what I've read and inferred is true, then the ATX supply that we still use today is derived from LPX, and that in turn means that Western Digital, and indeed the IBM PS2, had a role in defining the future of PC design, which is still affecting us to this day. It's bizarre to me to think that the 1200 watt modular Thermaltake power supply is still based on the footprint of the PS2 Model 30 supply, but hey, it makes sense, right? They had a good idea, so it makes sense that Western Digital would steal it from them, and it makes even more sense that everybody else would steal it from Western Digital. This all scans. I'm just not sure why anyone cared about this good idea. Other companies had come up with smaller PCs and supplies throughout the 80s, but none of those caught on as de facto standards. What with LPX being intended only for desktop-style machines and only from OEMs, it seems like none of this would have mattered in the DIY world or with any of the increasingly popular tower designs, and yet both adopted this new power supply. Why? I don't know. The only explanation would seem to be that everyone was drawing from some central standard, but I got nothing on what that would have been. At a wild guess, though, maybe it was the seemingly mythical baby AT. I don't know what that standard might have specified when it appeared in the 80s, but maybe, like ATX itself, it was updated over time. Maybe in late 89 or early 1990, a new version came out that added accommodations for the new breed of tower PCs and also happened to include the LPX power supply as a requirement. Certainly, I can't see any other good reason for all the vendors to independently switch to this new design overnight, so unless someone can prove otherwise, I'm just going to start assuming that's what happened. But if all this is true, then it really alters how I think about the landscape of late 80s and 90s computing. I mean, for one thing, the PS2 obviously wasn't as irrelevant as I thought. And I'll admit, I screwed this up tremendously when I first made this video. I had to reshoot several big chunks of it because I completely forgot about things like VGA and the 3.5-inch floppy drive. I mean, hell, the wiki page even says the PS2 gave us 72-pin memory, and at a glance, I can't disprove that. So, while I've always thought of it as an evolutionary dead end, I admit with great embarrassment that I've never given the PS2 enough credit for its technology. But it now seems apparent that it also had a huge impact on broader PC design. For one thing, while nerds started building their own systems with gusto going into the 90s, and many of those were probably tower designs, the desktop form factor remained incredibly popular in the pre-built market, which of course was the engine behind the meteoric rise of home computing throughout the 90s. Most of the machines that feature in people's first memories of using Windows 95 or logging onto the internet sat on a desk with a monitor on top, and it turns out most of those were probably based on LPX, whether they were Compacts, Dells, or even IBMs. That sure is a punchline, right? Like, we already knew IBM just turned into another generic clone vendor in the 90s, but it somehow seems even more ironic that some of their more prolific product lines were based on a copy of the machine that they created to shut down the copies. I think the fruit was just too juicy to resist, though. LPX was a great design, and it sold like gangbusters. Why fight the feeling? But on top of all that, LPX even impacted the DIY market because it now seems it gave us the power supply we take for granted, without which PCs of all types may have remained comically oversized well up into the 90s. All of which would seem to make this an incredibly important standard that I think has simply been standing in our collective blind spot for decades. I'm not saying nobody knew about LPX. People talk about it from time to time on the various retro forums, and again, there is a wiki page. I haven't dug up some deep hidden secret here, but I've never seen this broadly acknowledged, and nobody I knew had ever heard of it. Again, though, I think that's just because us nerds are picky and elitist. Even if we're willing to ooh and ah over a nicely preserved Packard Bell, we still regard it like any other pre-built. We assume it's overpriced, underpowered, and generally not state-of-the-art. So as a community, we've just not given these machines much thought. If all my conclusions are true, though, then we have to accept that LPX branched off from a newer, more advanced version of the PC platform than the baby ATs that we all regarded as superior at the time, and ain't that a weird pill to swallow? All the same, though, much of this does depend on the assumption that LPX specified this new power supply, and I have no hard proof of that, just vague allusions. So I guess we have a mission now, don't we? Somebody has to find these specs. They must be out there. Western Digital or Acer or somebody must have emailed or faxed or couriered a crappy mimeograph of something you could call a spec to someone who still has it laying around in their attic. So if you're that person, or if you can find that person, please scan the damn thing and put it up on Internet Archive or mail it to me and I'll do it. Because by all appearances, this is a keystone in the history of the PC and we should really have a record of it. Unless and until that happens, though, I think that's all I have to say about this. So, once again, happy 30th birthday to ATX, which is superior to all the things I've discussed in this video. And I guess happy 44th birthday to the PC in general. It was never meant to last beyond a couple years. It was never supposed to define a platform, and it suffered plenty of missteps over the decades, but I'll never stop respecting its versatility. It's some of the most flexible technology we've ever come up with, and I know some people find it boring. I've had some of my biggest fans ask me to please stop making so many videos about PC hardware, but I don't know what to tell you. It's a bottomless pit of weird approaches to problem solving that I never really get tired of exploring. So sorry, I guess. I'm gonna keep doing this. I'm done with it for today though. So I hope you had a good time watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to my channel and maybe turn on notifications if you want to find out when I upload new stuff. But if you really liked this, consider supporting me on Patreon like these folks are doing. This is my full-time job, and I couldn't afford to buy stuff like this to show you, pay for a studio to show you the stuff in, or pay my bills while I write about said stuff without their help. I'm incredibly grateful to everyone who's supporting me. Thank you all so much. And everyone else, thanks for watching.